148 billion of that is the general fund. The general fund is really the fund that everybody talks about. That's the discretionary fund that the legislature has some authority to modify and debate about for appropriation purposes. So that's the one that's always in the news, the general fund, and that's about $148 billion. Combined, all funds is about $215 billion to be precise. And that's across restricted funds that nobody talks about because those are earmarked without any flexibility. So of the general fund, the $148 billion, the three critical components that you should be aware of is number one, education. Education is $80 billion of the general fund. It is the single largest line item. So when you hear people from the teachers unions, for example, talk about how education is being cut, how per pupil spending is going to the ground, that is a lie. In fact, education appropriation is increasing in the state, and per pupil spending, when you compare it to other states across the country, is actually in the top half. The reason why a lot of the unions say that per pupil spending is going down is because they do fuzzy math. They basically fiddle with the appropriation and do this kind of purchasing power parity, and they decide that, well, it's more expensive to live in California, and so we should adjust the dollars in California and make them comparable. So it's basically fuzzy math. But if you look at just the raw dollars, we actually spend more on education than any other state in the country, and on a per pupil spending, we're in the top half. So we are making expenditures in education. The reason why we're failing in education has little to do with the appropriation and a lot to do with the warped priorities of this state and the excessive power that we give over to the unions and teacher tenure rules and other impediments to reform, to real education reform. I applaud the work of Stephen Smith, and we need to get behind this initiative, by the way. Let's give Stephen an applause, because education reform, in my view, is the next civil rights issue of our day, and it is perhaps the lowest hanging fruit in terms of conversion of Democrats, especially from communities like mine that are underserved, working class, minority communities that have been neglected for years when it comes to education. So I think that that is one issue that Republicans have the moral high ground on. We don't do enough of a good job of promoting that issue in our position, but we absolutely have the moral high ground on that issue, and we can convert minority communities and Democrats in communities like this region over to the Republican Party. I'm convinced of that if we do a better job. Other key components of the budget is healthcare. About $40 billion of the budget is healthcare, and most of that is Medicaid. Another warped program that has a lot of corruption. Study after study shows just how much money is wasted in the Medicaid program as managed in the state of California. We need to do a better job on overhauling the healthcare system. I've talked about reforming the incentive structure for healthcare, coming up with a health savings account, for example, and we can do that overnight by converting those that are participating in the Medicaid program so that they have a stake in the services that they're receiving and can price discriminate, which can create an economic condition for lowering the cost of production or the cost of services. That's really, really important for long-term healthcare reform. But that's another key area, $40 billion for healthcare. About $15 billion is for corrections. So that's another key component. All of these, by the way, are appropriations that are growing in excess of population growth in the state of California. So we are growing government out of proportion with population growth. That's a really critical early warning indicator to be mindful of. So another point that I'd like to make just on the expenditure side, the California Policy Center recently did a study a few years ago, very interesting, fascinating study that across all of the expenditure categories in the general fund, when you add them all together, about 85% of that actually goes to pay for salaries, benefits, and compensation for state employees and government employees. And that's a staggering amount. It'll become more relevant later in my talk when I talk about debt and the unfunded pension liability that is crippling the state. But it's because the expenditures on the front end bear a cost on the back end when we have to make retirement distributions. That's why we need to control the growth of expenditures as it relates to government workers and government employees. So be mindful of that statistic. 85% goes to pay salaries and benefits and compensation. Only 15% is more direct benefit to taxpayers in tangible ways. But indirect services is through government workers and compensation. Let's switch over to the revenue side. So in the budget that was approved, about $193 billion is coming from additional taxes and fees and basically revenue across all categories. $100 billion of that is personal income taxes. $100 billion of that. Now, a couple of points on the income tax. $2 billion of that is estimated to be incremental tax on taxpayers in California. I don't know how many of you enjoy paying more taxes or want to volunteer to pay even more, but the legislature seems to be under the impression that you guys want more taxes. So they've included $2 billion in incremental taxes this year. Some of it is the result of something that they call tax conformity. So you'll recall that our president recently initiated tax reform measures that by and large benefit most US taxpayers. And so what the government in the state of California wants to do is basically neutralize that benefit. So they say good things are coming out of the White House. Well, they believe this, they don't say it. But good things are coming out of the White House. And what we want to do is neutralize that benefit on California taxpayers. And so we're going to screw the taxpayer in California so that they don't experience any of the incremental benefit coming out of reforms at the federal level. And so $2 billion of that is the direct result of tax reform in the state of California to neutralize the benefit coming from tax reform out of the White House. Another component, $300 million of it, is also another neutralizing example on healthcare. So you'll recall that President Trump did away with the Obamacare mandate for penalizing individuals that are not participating in Obamacare or don't otherwise have healthcare insurance. I mean, this is a forced fee on everybody that is not participating in what President Obama wanted individuals to do. And so President Trump gave us greater flexibility and freedom about our healthcare decisions. But now the state of California says that's a benefit that we cannot extend to California taxpayers. So now we're going to penalize those California taxpayers that are not participating in the medical exchanges. And so that's going to be another $300 million in additional revenue. Another $300 million is for the 911 emergency response system. So there's some additional revenue fundraising for that program. Altogether, when you add up all the revenue and compare it to all of the expenditure that I talked about a few moments ago, we end up with a surplus of about $21.5 billion. So that's the difference between the revenue and the expenditure. And it's at that point, when that number was revealed, that Governor Newsom basically celebrated. He partied up in Sacramento and said, we're doing great, we're in the black, we've never had it this great. But that's where he stopped. He did not talk about something that's underlying the reality, and that is the debt. This is the liability. You're thinking about it from an accounting perspective, it's the balance sheet. So what we have with the budget is a fiscal year concept of revenue and expenditures, and that's it. That is what any discussion of budgetary surplus is limited to. It's just the current fiscal year intake and outtake, and that's it. But it has no visibility into the underlying debt of the state. And that's where I think we have a subterfuge. That's where I think we have a misleading perspective from the governor, is that he's not facing the truth about the underlying debt. In fact, of the budgetary surplus, that $21.5 billion, half of it went automatically to pay down some of the unfunded pension liability. So even the governor recognizes that we have a lot of debt that is out of control. But it is only a band-aid solution, I'm afraid. So only about $5 billion, I think, went directly to pay for the unfunded pension obligation. But our unfunded pension debt is a staggering $1 trillion. That's according to the Stanford University Economics Research Institute. They peg the amount of the unfunded obligation at $1 trillion. And what Governor Newsom did in trying to pay that down was appropriate about $5 billion from the surplus to pay that down. $5 billion out of $1 trillion. I mean, that's like a band-aid to what should be triple bypass surgery. Okay, really. And if you don't believe the Stanford economists, look, I went to Stanford undergraduate, and I have a lot of respect for the Economics Research Institute. I ascribe a lot of authority. I think $1 trillion is a very realistic number. But if you don't take the word of the Stanford economists, go with what Citigroup Pension Liability Index monitors the size and growth of the pension unfunded liabilities across the country, and they peg the amount at closer to $700 million. But when you throw in the promised health care, we get over $1 trillion very, very easily. But the Stanford economists basically converge on a discount rate that is a lot closer to what we call the risk-free rate of return, which is, in my academic opinion, is a more realistic discount rate to use. So the point is that we have $1 trillion debt. When you add other debt that's on the books, we get closer to $1.3 trillion. Now here is the first risk that I want to identify for you. Okay, when you take into account the $1.3 trillion in debt and compare that to gross domestic product in the state of California, which is about $2.6 trillion, we end up with a figure that's about 52%. That's our debt to GDP ratio, 52%. But what's missing from that calculation is the state's share of federal debt. When you add the state's share of federal debt, we bring total debt to $3.1 trillion. So the numerator changes, but when you compare that to the existing denominator of the $2.6 trillion in gross domestic product, we suddenly end up with a ratio that's 125%. Now, for perspective, when you think about the peripheral Eurozone countries that suffered a crisis in 2011, 2012, you'll recall the austerity measures in Greece, in Portugal, and in Italy. Their debt to GDP ratios were hovering around 127 to 133%. Greece was 127% before their near collapse a few years ago. And we are hovering in the state of California at 125%. So as an economist, to me, that is an alarming early warning indicator. So that's one important risk that you should be aware of. Another important risk is on the revenue side. So the governor likes to extol how we've brought in more money. Of course, he's taxed us to death, but there's also a risk to that revenue intake, and that is that we're losing people from California to other states. We've had a net out migration of 38,000 people in 2018, and it's the second year in a row where we have lost people relative to migration coming into the state. So think about that, because when those people leave, they take their economic power, they take their income, and that's going to other states that have more favorable environments. Texas, other states that are more and more favorable. Another interesting observation on the revenue side is that we've got 1%, the top 1% of income earners in the state of California, you can believe this, contribute 50% of total personal tax in the state of California. Okay, the top 1%. Now, with President Trump's tax reform measures a few years ago, we did away with the state and local tax deduction. And so what that means is that now it's a little bit less attractive for very wealthy people to reside in a high tax regime like California, because more of that money is not going to be deductible for federal tax purposes. I mean, I think it was an appropriate decision by the president to simplify the code, but the necessary consequence is that now it's unattractive to live in a high tax rate state like California. And so I calculate that even if we lose 10% of the top 1% of income earners, I mean, that's a very small amount. If 10% of those income earners say that it's no longer attractive to live in California, they're going to move to Nevada or Texas or other states and still have their vacation home in the state, we're going to lose $5 billion overnight. Just with 10% of the top income earners leaving the state of California, we forego $5 billion in personal income tax overnight. So the pressure to that debt to GDP ratio is on both numerator and denominator. So to make a long story short, the governor celebrated this surplus of $21.5 billion, but it is not the whole truth. The truth, the cold reality, is that we have a pension scheme that is out of control at over $1 trillion, and that we have a combined debt to GDP ratio that is approaching the alarming levels of the peripheral Eurozone countries that experienced near collapse a few years ago. And so I want to leave you with that kernel of thoughts, because the problem is severe in the state, and we need people that are responsible to get into government at all levels of government. I mean, I'm on the city council, and just yesterday my colleagues wanted to pay almost $500,000 to repair the bathroom, the restroom in the park. $500,000, that's the price of a home. So, if you think about this, abuse at the local level, magnify that multiple times at the state level. Not to talk about the federal level as well, with Congress members, but there is so much abuse from a financial perspective, and I'm very critical of the class of politician that we get in a lot of these positions of power. I mean, I'm not going to name names, but I met a Democratic Assembly person, not too long ago, And I was talking to that individual about pension reform and the discount rate, and she gave me these glazed eyes and a glazed stare. She had no idea what I was talking about. And she is part of a governmental body making decisions on a $215 billion budget. That is a very scary prospect. Anyway, I'm going to conclude my remarks. I'm happy to take questions, and again, it's an absolute delight for me to be here with you today. Thank you all.